This episode of Trifles is brought to you by listeners like you, who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the colorman was retired, the three-quarter was missing, and the client was illustrious, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever wondered why Sherlock Holmes had 3 different colored dressing gowns? Or what a Crockford is?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 420. Who wasn't Jack the Ripper? Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
Burt, I'm pretty sure you weren't Jack the Ripper.
No, I've got a complete alibi. I was rearranging my sock drawer and working on the stamp collection that I don't have during the Ripper murders, so I'm completely in the clear.
Wait a minute. Maybe this is a future Trifles episode, but how in Victorian times, how were the elastics on the legs of your socks? Did they hold up fairly well?
Only with the appropriate sock garters, which I always got from my gardener. I found out that gardener garters were really stronger than regular sock garters. And for the first few times I wore them, boy, oh boy, did I feel silly. I thought they hooked around your ears. And, I'd go to the cafe, I'd ask for a latte, and people would look at me. And originally I thought it was because I was asking for a latte, and they didn't know what that was. And then while I did that, somebody gave me a copy of a photograph of Lotte Lenya. And I said, no, latte, not Lottie. And I don't know, it went downhill from there.
I think it went downhill a few minutes ago. Yeah.
Oh, dear. Well, that'll teach you to ask me those kinds of questions.
Indeed. Well, we're going to talk about Jack the Ripper. And, maybe garters do come into play with Jack the Ripper. Maybe he was embarrassed to get disrobed in front of those women of the night because he was wearing garters on his socks. And we all know how silly it looks for the man standing there in his underwear and garters.
No, I think it was the nightshirts. The nightshirts just offended him. He said, wait a minute, I'm not,
I think that was nightshades.
Oh, deadly. How deadly. Yeah, you're right. They were deadly.
It was poisoning. Well, this is one of those Trifles episodes where we're talking about an old piece of scholarship. And interestingly enough, we have 2 back-to-back pieces of scholarship from the same issue of the Baker Street Journal that both touch on Jack the Ripper. So we thought it would be an opportunity to put them both together. They're fairly short and talk about that. So if you would like to support the show in any way, we have options for you. You can support us on Substack or on Patreon. Just simply visit the links in our show notes, which of course you can find at SherlockHolmesPodcast.com or in whatever app you happen to be listening to us right now. You can choose whichever platform makes sense for you to support us on and at whatever level you are comfortable with. Your contribution helps us to do the research, host the files, put the show together, full production, the whole thing. And we do want to reward you for that. And at the end of every month, all of our supporters are thrown into a big barrel. Well, their names, at least, are thrown into a big barrel. That would be another kind of contest.
Sardines.
And we choose your name at random to determine who gets a free back issue of the Baker Street Journal. So that is part of the benefit of joining here. We also have bonus content occasionally. And this season, we're going to have Trifling Trifles, shorter episodes that capture some topics that maybe don't make their way to a full episode. So that's some additional content for you to thank you for being a supporter. Okay, well, we find ourselves in the midst of Volume 17, Number 4 of the Baker Street Journal. When was this published, and why was this particular time frame significant, Bert?
It's a major milestone in the Sherlockian world, not just the irregular world. It published in December 1967. If you can find a copy of it and take a look at this issue of the Baker Street Journal, which is Volume 17, Number 4, December 1967. If you have the EBSJ, of course, you've already got it at your fingertips, you'll see a little snapshot of the Sherlockian world. Two major events: the passing of Bill Baring Gould, William S. Baring Gould, the editor, compiler, author of annotated Sherlock Holmes, died at a time before his book, his annotated Sherlock Holmes, was even available. It also marks the passing of Basil Rathbone. But when you look at the editorial content, you get a window that you might not recognize into the mind of Julian Wolfe, who was the editor, because it's an amazing array of things, including a pastiche and including an article from a couple of irregulars who never became official irregulars, a couple of articles, one of whom was a 14-year-old boy. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about an evergreen topic here, Jack the Ripper and Sherlock Holmes. And so that's our focus today.
Excellent. Well, why don't we begin with the title article by Bruce Dettman. It's called Who Wasn't Jack the Ripper? And go ahead.
Perfect. Dettman is another one of these folks that I just alluded to who published in the journal, but apparently were never sort of followed through and stayed connected to the irregulars. But Dettman begins, right on the point here about the connection between the characters and stories and cases of Sherlock Holmes and Jack the Ripper. Over the years, he says, there's been widespread conjecture in Sherlockian circles over Holmes's involvement in the Ripper murders. And not only do people who write about this try to fit him into the investigation of these bizarre crimes, but quite often they intend to identify the Ripper as somebody in the canon. And there have been instances, he says, where Athelney Jones and Horace Harker and Dr. Watson, and most ridiculously of all, Holmes himself, have been identified as Jack the Ripper. And he says, I would now like to state unequivocally that in my opinion, no individual in the canon was either directly or indirectly responsible for the Whitechapel murders. And I do not feel that there's any real incriminating evidence in any of those articles which would lead the author to making a positive identification as they have done.
Well, that's encouraging to know that at the very least. And Bruce goes on to say that in looking at some of these articles, well, you come across interesting parallels that might lead the reader to some speculation involving some of the previously mentioned characters and the Ripper. But it should also be heavily stressed that this is not too unusual in literary investigations of the kind. Especially, I may add, in Sherlockian literature. If you dig hard enough, you'll usually be able to turn up something which presents interesting factors or coincidences. After all, I seriously doubt that Rex Stout actually believed that Watson was a woman. But if you examine his article, you'll find that Mr. Stout does present some interesting, if not alarming, arguments.
And then Dettman goes on to give us the outline of the Ripper cases and quickly put on the 3rd of April, 1888 in Whitechapel, this notorious area of London, a streetwalker named Emma Elizabeth Smith is found dead with many stab wounds. 6 more murders follow over a period of 6 months. There's a letter sent to Scotland Yard after one of the murders signed by Jack the Ripper. and after the seventh victim, the crime suddenly and mysteriously ended. And investigations continued for years, but the Ripper has never been comprehensively, completely, convincingly, accurately identified. And then he takes us through the 1888 cases of Sherlock Holmes, following the chronology which he has at the time. Remember, the Baring-Gould chronology has not yet been published, so he's got Henry Folsom's chronology. He uses that to identify the dates of the Ripper murders and where they took place in 1888.
And it's worth noting that there were 6 murders, I believe. Seven murders in 1888. The first in April, then there were 2 in August, 1 in September, 2 in October, and 1 in November. And when we look at Holmes's cases during this 6-month period, Dettman writes, he says that it is clear that Holmes was not overwhelmed with work. So during April, when the first murder was committed, he was on the yellow face, which that was a 1-day case. And then the next time we have a murder in August, the Ripper struck with his second and third crimes. Holmes was involved in, again, only one case, the cardboard box, and that took 3 days to complete. And we get to September, when Annie Chapman was slain. Well, that's the 2-day case of Silver Blaze. 5th and 6th murders in October. That was during the Noble Bachelor. And November of 1888, the only significant event, Bruce writes, was Watson's marriage to Mary Morstan. So there are no cases, as far as we know, in that month. So Holmes was not professionally busy during those months.
Yeah, well said. Well, I really have to point out my own personal footnote here, which is that really in 1 year, 7 cases of Sherlock Holmes is rather a good number, because Watson tells us many times in the cases of Sherlock Holmes, he's not reporting every case. He's only reporting those that he believes would be interesting, show favorably to Holmes's talents, and had a definite conclusion. But that last point gets us to where Dettman is going. He says if we assume Holmes did take up an investigation, because after all, he could not have missed noticing the Ripper murders, the incredibly visible murders, and the pattern they followed. Either he discovered, says Dettman, the identity of the Ripper, and for some reason was never revealed, or, as much as I hate to think about it, he says, Sherlock Holmes failed. Well, I choose the latter because of what I feel is the absurdity of the former. It seems highly unlikely that the criminal of the century who'd captured the imagination of young and old alike was caught and brought to justice, either incarcerated or executed, and was never heard of again. Well, then, of course, there are those who feel he was killed during the investigation and that his identity was such that it was better kept a secret. But I must still adhere to the theory that this was one of Holmes's failures.
And he says, I have no direct basis for this theory, although a strong indication comes from Watson himself in The Yellow Face, published in 1893, 5 years after the Ripper murders. He says, regarding Holmes's successes and failures, where he failed, it happened too often that no one else succeeded, and that the tale was left forever without a conclusion. Could Watson be hinting here of Holmes's greatest failure? An unsuccessful attempt to capture the most sensational criminal of the century. Now, this was obviously the reason for Holmes's lack of cases during the period. He most probably had to turn away clients as he was on the scent of the Ripper.
One last interesting point remains, says Dettman. When on a stormy September evening in 1889, the year later, the doomed John Openshaw says to Holmes he's heard that he's never been beaten. Holmes replies, I've been beaten 4 times, 3 times by men and once by a woman. Well, the identity of one of these men is easily guessed. Irene Adler was in good company. Bum, bum, bum.
There we go. Well, that certainly is one valid take on Sherlock Holmes and Jack the Ripper. It's followed up directly in the next few pages by Bruce Kenedy. Now, Bruce Kenedy became an active Sherlockian. He was a young college student, I believe, at this time, but he became quite active. And if you happen to be at the BSI weekend, as we're releasing this, and you listen to it before the weekend, come up to me and ask me about my connection to Bruce Kenedy. I'll just leave it at that.
Oh, good, good. I like that.
And maybe for our Patreon and Substack supporters, I'll submit some additional evidence to show my connection to Bruce Kenedy, exclusive for our supporters.
Ooh, excellent. And you can be entered into a raffle for a new car. No, sorry. Just getting enthusiastic again. Well, Bruce at this time, 1967, he is in college. He's still with us in Fulton, Missouri. And he is was then the Bannister of the Three Students Plus and editor of their publication. And Bruce was invested the next year in 1968 as Bannister. Well, he says here, Jack in Abyss is in the following essay. No Sherlockian may make a complete study of the cases of Sherlock Holmes without a study of Jack the Ripper. In recent issues of the Baker Street Journal and elsewhere, no fewer than 3 men have been accused of being this infamous slayer: Athelney Jones, Dr. Watson, and even Holmes himself. Well, bear in mind what Dettman has already told us about that. It's strange that Watson didn't distinctly mention Holmes's work on the case, for Holmes could hardly overlook the most daring criminal of his lifetime. But did he overlook Jack? Well, I found clues, he says, in the final problem. For who else could possibly have been the Ripper other than Moriarty himself?
The Napoleon of crime. And Holmes himself says he's the organizer of half that is evil and nearly all that is undetected in this great city. This alone, writes Kenedy, is enough evidence to convict him. The Ripper, it said, must have had scientific training to carry out his slayings with the level of detail that he did. Moriarty, as a mathematician, would have had such training in his studies to prepare him for a career in math. And Holmes, of course, dedicated all of his energy to exposing and breaking up Moriarty's ring, so he would naturally pay more attention to exposing the Ripper than any other man at that time.
And Holmes goes on to say to Watson, for years, I have endeavored to break through the veil, and Moriarty later says in a sort of answer to this, on the 23rd, you incommoded me. By the middle of February, I was seriously inconvenienced by you. At the end of March, I was absolutely hampered in my plans. Well, although the Ripper murders took place several years before the final problem, this in no way breaks down the above evidence, for Moriarty was fighting for his life in his battle against Holmes. That, he says, is the reason for the murder's sudden ceasing.
It seems strange that neither the bunglers at Scotland Yard nor Sherlock Holmes could throw some light on the case, and so Holmes independently traced the murderers down to the Napoleon of crime, Moriarty himself. One further note of evidence is found in the same story in another comment by Holmes. My horror at his crimes was lost in my admiration at his skill. Indeed, the crimes were horrible and showed a great amount of skill in their being carried out.
And so there, and now he quotes, there, deep down in that dreadful cauldron of swirling water and seething foam, will lie for all time the most dangerous criminal of this generation.
Well, that would make sense why Jack the Ripper ceased committing his crimes, because he was at the bottom of the Reichenbach.
Yeah, well, see, if Bob Katz were here, he would say, well, I don't know. The diagnostic evidence of the professor's condition makes it extremely unlikely, but then that's for another day.
And that is no trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
It's true these murders are the work of a madman, but a madman with certain medical skills, considerable intelligence, and education.
Then if you're right, Mr. Holmes.